In the heavy darkness over the Mediterranean Sea, a Russian oil tanker drifted quietly into the waters south of Crete. Inside was an oil deal worth more than 2 billion rubles and a senior GRU general. Moscow believed this was a safe inland corridor where distance and darkness formed the perfect shield. But they overlooked one thing: Ukraine's ability to strike from the shadows. 7 minutes after a commercial satellite captured the vessel, the imagery was sent directly to Kyiv. The decision to strike was made the same night from a disguised fishing vessel more than 560 miles away. 2 UJ-26 Bober drones were launched. They flew low over the waves in total silence. No GPS, no radio. They slipped through commercial radar seams, threaded through AIS blind spots, and headed straight for the target coordinates. At 4:16 a.m., the Kendall's technical deck was penetrated. 4.7 seconds later, flames surged nearly 100 feet into the air. General Averyanov vanished. The oil deal collapsed. All that remained was smoke, fire, and a message quietly sent from Kyiv. No place is safe anymore. At 3:05 a.m. on December 19, 2025, the Kendall, an Oman-flagged oil tanker, was drifting slowly south of Crete, 68 miles off the coast. Its engines maintained a steady 8 knots to keep the satellite link stable. From the outside, it looked like an unarmed commercial vessel, but inside was a shipment of crude worth more than 2.3 billion rubles. It was being moved along Russia's Shadow Fleet route in exchange for weapons in Syria. More importantly, intelligence from human sources indicated at least one GRU general was on board. This was likely Andrei Averyanov, commander of Unit 29,155, responsible for sabotage, assassinations, and covert operations abroad. The Kendall was not simply an oil tanker. It was a critical node in Russia's clandestine logistics chain, linking the Black Sea to Middle Eastern transit ports. Behind the facade of commerce, Moscow used vessels like this to exchange oil for weapons, bypass sanctions, and sustain its long war effort in Ukraine. Ukraine knew this. There was no chance they would allow the tanker to reach the port of Tartus. A meticulously planned operation had been prepared, waiting only for the prey to arrive. 2 hours earlier, off the Libyan coast, an old fishing vessel with a commercial registry quietly entered international waters. No one paid attention to it. The disguise was too perfect. It had a rusty hull, civilian radar, and fishing nets scattered across the deck. But inside the chilled storage bay, once used to preserve tuna, was a mobile UAV command center. It was hidden behind insulation blocks and fake cooling equipment. This was the mothership, the launch point of one of Ukraine's boldest strikes in the entire 2025 campaign. On deck was a GUR Special Operations team, posing as fishermen. They worked alongside 2 sealed crates holding 2 UJ-26 Bober drones. These units were optimized for long-range, low-speed, ultra-endurance missions. Each UAV weighed under 220 pounds. Built from radar-absorbent composite materials, they boasted a range exceeding 745 miles. They required no ground guidance once launched. The moment the satellite Q arrived, the 2 UJ-26 Bobers were rolled onto the launch platform. They were pushed off using a low-pressure pneumatic ram concealed under the deck. No blast, no heat signature, no electronic trace. Both drones activated autonomous mode, skimming just above the sea in absolute silence. From that moment on, the fishing boat's role was complete. Everything else depended on the 2 unmanned assassins. They were guided by internal navigation algorithms, inertial sensors, and infrared cameras. They operated fully independently, with all parameters pre-programmed using encrypted commercial satellite imagery. They raced away like 2 shadows. They stayed below 50 feet, hugging the edges of commercial radar zones. They exploited the Earth's curvature and low-level interference to remain invisible. One drone approached head-on from the southwest. The other looped in from the southeast, forming a pincer movement. Their route was calculated to the nautical mile, enough to skirt Syria's relay zone without breaching NATO airspace. Meanwhile, the Kendall continued northward at 8 knots toward Tartus. On deck, the Russian crew relaxed, chatting casually. They were likely imagining a hefty bonus from Rosneft or the Ministry of Defense for completing the special cargo run. No one feared an attack. They believed the war was far away. Ukraine, they thought, could never reach the Mediterranean. After months of smooth Shadow Fleet operations, vigilance had faded. No defensive systems were active. They were wrong. Death was less than 31 miles away, carrying a warhead equivalent to 50 kilograms of directional explosive. No one aboard the Kendall would sense what was coming. Civilian radar could not detect a small, low-flying, low-reflection object. The GRU General rested in the VIP cabin midship, right next to the engine room and central pressure system. In Zaporizhia, the auxiliary control station suddenly received a faint feed. It was relayed through a civilian satellite and amplified via linear bandwidth. Two black and white frames appeared. They showed the long silhouette of an oil tanker, a clear heat cluster from the engine compartment, and a familiar mid-deck layout. Both drones were in kill range. One locked onto the central pressure station, the hub of the fuel distribution system. The other targeted the aft pressure bay near the propeller shaft. This area housed the main drives, power core, and steering controls. 1 minute later, both drones accelerated to 130 miles per hour. They locked onto thermal signatures, armed their warheads, and continued forward in silence. The final run was only 2.5 miles. It was enough to change the fate of a strategic oil deal, and possibly a general's career. Inside the Zaporizhia station, the screen showed a dark hall, glowing faintly from central heat emissions. It was a perfect target. Both drones closed in. The Kendall still showed no reaction. Range? 1,214 feet, then 1,007, then 853. The countdown began. 5 seconds. 4, 3. Everything went silent. At exactly 4:16 a.m., Bober 1 approached the starboard side of the Kendall. The IR camera locked onto the pressure valve cluster feeding the main engine bay. At 40 feet altitude, it dipped at an 18-degree angle and dove. In the final 0.6 seconds, the 23-kilogram shaped charge activated. It produced a molten jet that pierced the steel hull at its weakest junction. The blast was small, but surgically precise. A 4.6-foot hole opened under the shaped charge effect. Conduits shattered, system pressure collapsed, the safety valve triggered, and a fire alert appeared. The crew had no time to respond. Bober 2 struck next, coming from the stern. Its target was the pressure deck near the propeller shaft, containing the main electrical hub and steering circuitry. Approaching almost at water level, it remained invisible to the crew. No cameras monitored the blind spot. No one saw anything until it was too late. At 15 feet, the warhead detonated early for optimal penetration, hitting the thinnest section of the hull. The blast incinerated the central electrical circuit. It destroyed the switchboard and knocked out all power within seconds. The Kendall lost control in under 90 seconds. Bridge indicators went dark. Navigation systems died. Displays froze. Radio links collapsed. All emergency relays failed. As the crew scrambled, gas leached from ruptured conduits in the central deck. A stray spark from an exposed circuit triggered the third blast. This was not from a drone, but from pressure buildup. Compartments ignited. Deck 2 was engulfed. The sealed structure drove pressure upward, forcing flames through mid-deck vents. The ship began tilting. Worse, the entire stern had been severed from central control. Smoke filled the bridge. Automatic fire suppression was offline due to power loss. Temperatures in the technical bay exceeded 572 degrees Fahrenheit. Insulation began melting. On deck, the captain attempted to broadcast a VHF distress call, but the transmitter had died with the first blast. Panic spread. Radar showed nothing. No engine signatures, no warnings, no collisions. The attack had been silent, invisible, and instantaneous. Someone shouted, "Where is General Avrianov?" No one answered. The logistics general, believed to be on board for supervising the strategic oil transfer, had not been seen since the second blast. Within 5 minutes, the entire middeck was an inaccessible red zone. Burn through gas lines increased the pressure, pushing heat along the hull. From afar, the Kendall still looked like a peaceful merchant ship, but inside, it was entering an irreversible destruction cycle. At 4:20 a.m., a commercial satellite detected abnormal heat at 34 degrees 35 minutes north, 24 degrees 17 minutes east. This was south of Crete. The Greek AIS monitoring center issued an alert. A tanker had lost communication and was signaling smoke. No one knew a GRU General was on board. 2 minutes later, SkySat imagery showed 2 clear burn points. One was midship, and one was near engine bay number 3. Minutes later, a smoke plume nearly 200 feet high drifted south of Crete. One high-pressure pump was destroyed. Backup power was gone. All radio links were silent. The crew signaled distress using lights. The third explosion, at 4:22 a.m., caused by pressure in compartment number 3, blew apart the stern. A massive plume rose, visible from the Cretan coast. Soon after, Russia's Ministry of Defense received a coded alert from its Tartus relay station. A logistics vessel had gone dark. The internal report reached Moscow. But what shocked the Kremlin was not the loss of the ship. It was the last known position of General Andrei Avryanov. He was believed to be on the Kendall under the cover of supervising a shipment. Amid the chaos, no one could confirm whether Avryanov was alive or had vanished with the central compartments. The Kremlin convened an emergency meeting. Data indicated a non-military strike. There were no missile signatures, no electronic warfare activity, and no large UAV detections. But one fact was undeniable. This was not a war zone. This was a supposedly safe international corridor, frequently used by Russian vessels to avoid Western surveillance. Global insurers began to panic. Within 6 hours, 9 reinsurance firms demanded contract reviews for any civilian vessels linked to Russia. This applied even to those under Panama flags. A day later, premiums for Russian oil routes through the Mediterranean rose 11.7%. This forced at least 4 routes to divert through the Red Sea. The financial impact was small, but the psychological shock was enormous. Ukraine had struck a key economic artery. Even more critical was the disappearance of General Avryanov. Under the guise of a military logistics advisor, he had overseen assassinations abroad. He was the technical architect of Europe's Novichok poisonings. If he was truly on the Kendall, this was not merely an accidental death. It was the planned removal of one of the GRU's most elusive figures. Russian media remained silent. The Ministry of Defense issued a cold statement. A transport vessel experienced technical failure offshore, cause unknown. But Maxar satellite images and Italian Navy infrared footage circulated within NATO. An internal US report concluded that the probability this was a long-range precision UAV strike launched by Ukraine was extremely high. Ukraine's general staff said nothing. The next morning, Moscow issued sudden internal personnel reshuffles without explanation. The GRU was ordered not to mention Avryanov. His office was sealed. Rumors spread he was either dead or captured by a third party. Ukraine claimed no credit. They released no footage. They said nothing at all. But the results were obvious. A $1 billion ruble oil deal collapsed. A senior general disappeared. Russia's maritime logistics fell into shock. And the message was delivered without words. It came in the form of a column of smoke over the Mediterranean, in a place no one believed could be struck.